Hello, dear viewers of my channel. I'm glad to see you all in this new video, and today we will talk about the fall of Berlin. Enjoy watching. When the spring of 1945 came into its own, Berlin had for a long time been living in the shadow of inevitability. Gaps in supply that had opened up, empty shop windows, and constant air raid alarms had become part of everyday life. But what began in mid-April, and especially from April 16th, changed this coarse habit of fear. The front drew near, and fear became a tangible wall whose rumble everyone could hear. First, the attack on the Seelow heights. The Germans called that week the last barrier. On the morning of April 16, 1945, Soviet troops opened the offensive with artillery and rocket fire whose force surpassed everything many had seen before. By modern estimates, in the first 30 minutes of the artillery preparation on the Seelow Heights sector, more than 500,000 shells were fired. Surviving German soldiers recalled that the ground literally sang and cracked under the unceasing fire. This was not just artillery preparation, it was a wave of explosions that buried visibility, tore apart communications, and broke the will to resist. From the city districts that week came anxious reports. The railways were smashed, supply columns heading toward Berlin barely made their way through, and many units were running out of ammunition. The capital's defense was built from what remained. Elements of the regular army, SS units, the People's Militia, adolescents and women conscripted to prepare fortifications. Nevertheless, the Germans continued to repair barricades and hoist flags because surrender meant the end of the old world, and many could not come to terms with it. Inside the city itself, the calm before the storm did not last long. After the breakthrough of the defensive line on the Seelow Heights and the river's transition to the offensive, the Soviet fronts moved toward Berlin's walls. By the end of April, the city center found itself besieged. The encirclement was tight. Some districts were ringed with virtually no possibility of evacuation. Germans remaining in Berlin saw from the streets tank columns moving toward the city and watched planes appear and multiply in the sky, preparing to strike key positions. The mass of forces drawn to operations on the approaches and inside the city was colossal. One consolidated account notes that to fight for Berlin and assault the defensive lines, Soviet troops concentrated millions of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces, and thousands of armored vehicles, making the offensive heavy and all-consuming. Nights in the city became different. Before the assault took on a mass character, German apartments hummed with conversation and crying. Residents discussed evacuation routes and waited for transport that did not come. Then came bombardments not only by the Allies' air force, but also by heavy artillery fire, Katyusha barrages, and mortars. Over the years of war, Berlin had already endured many air raids, but the final siege brought a different, localized intensity. The fire focused on street fighting, on destroying defensive strongpoints, on burned-out quarters. During the war, Berlin experienced hundreds of Allied bomber raids. This left the city in a state of constant exhaustion. Tanks, they were sound, smell, and terror in one. German fighters spoke of iron columns that came by the thousands. T-34s and self-propelled guns like enormous beetles moved slowly but inexorably through the streets. Anti-tank ditches, obstacles, burned vehicles, everything seemed futile against the massed armor supported by infantry and aviation. The Germans had little systemic support. Strategic reserves were exhausted, contact with the outside world was often cut off, and counterattacks, if launched at all, were local and paid for with heavy losses. In the urban setting, every shot, every flash from a hit meant tragedy for civilians. In houses where neighbors had quarreled the day before and shared their last bread, wounded and dead now lay. Hospitals that were still functioning were overcrowded. Surgical stations set up in basements received women, children, the elderly, and young fighters. Overall, the losses were enormous. Modern studies give varying estimates, but reports point to tens of thousands killed among the civilian population and tens of thousands killed and wounded among the military during the operation as a whole. Across the entire Berlin operation, scholars and archives produce estimates on the order of hundreds of thousands of human losses when all fronts and related episodes are combined. German fighters in their memoirs often emphasized not so much the statistics as the sense of the end of the system, when order turned into chaos and familiar landmarks disappeared. One old serviceman later wrote that there were moments when nothing could be seen from the windows and it seemed that the whole city was burning at once. No less horror was caused by the way the street fighting unfolded. The density of the residential quarters, narrow streets, tightly pressed houses, courtyards made combat nightmarish. Fighting for individual houses, street ambushes, night assaults, all this intensified the feeling of helplessness. Water supplies were cut, electricity went out, and people were forced to survive without basic infrastructure. In these conditions, looting, chaos, and fear pushed people to desperate acts. Some tried to flee, some hid in basements and prayed. The fall of Berlin was not only the result of massive external strikes, but also the collapse of inner-city defense. Command, disunited and deprived of stable communications, sometimes made decisions that seemed meaningless to those standing in the streets. Orders to hold quarter after quarter often meant delaying withdrawal and, as a consequence, enormous casualties. Many soldiers and officers said after the war, "We held on because we saw no other way out, because our honor and oath demanded steadfastness, but in our hearts we understood it was pointless." Attacks by the Western Allies also pressed on the city, not only by direct raids, but by the constant threat from aviation and artillery coordinated with the advance of the Red Army. The interaction of Western Allied air forces and the advancing Soviet troops created double pressure. From the sky came bombings, and from the land, massed attacks of armored forces. The Germans felt themselves between two hammers. Internal tension grew, and morale fell.
One of the most agonizing aspects was the losses and torn-apart families. The women who remained in Berlin often became bearers of pain. They were later remembered as those who carried the city on their shoulders in the final days. Many stories have been preserved about mothers who led children through the ruins in search of food, about the elderly praying in half-ruined churches, about youths throwing themselves at fortifications because they knew no other way. When the final act came at the end of April, the last days of the month, many Germans in bunkers realized the end was near. Rumors of suicides by the top leadership, of Hitler's death in the bunker spread, and fear for one's own fate began to be replaced by fear of occupation. On the night of April 30th, 1945, in an underground shelter in Berlin, the light went out for one man. Thus the symbolic reign ended, and many of its subjects felt a colossal relief and at the same time a fall into an abyss of uncertainty. After the suicide of the top leadership, the city remained for a long time a field of chaotic actions. Some surrendered, some tried to leave, many stayed to await a decision. When, a few days later, the city was effectively taken, the official capitulation of Berlin occurred on May 8, 1945, the street silence that fell afterward was full of weight. Soldiers stood on the ruins, but their faces showed fatigue, amazement, and sorrow. For the residents of Berlin, a time came when they had to compare what they had endured with all expectations, how to live on, how to pick up the fragments of everyday life and memories, how to come to terms with the losses. After the war, former fighters and residents recounted differently. Some blamed the system, others survived and built a new life. Veterans remembered both horror and moments of humanity, how a victorious soldier helped carry a child out of a cellar, how sometimes, simultaneously with a shot, a cry for help was heard, and then silence. And in these small episodes, the reflection of the whole tragedy, the fall of a great empire, the turning of a capital into a battlefield, the countless losses of human lives.